2 out of the 4 Gospel writers felt the need to tell us about Jesus' birth. Mark's Gospel, probably the first to have been written down, launches straight into telling us about John the Baptist, the forerunner of the Messiah, as promised in the Old Testament prophets. John's Gospel, probably the last Gospel to be written, starts way back at the creation of the world and then rushes past Jesus' birth when he says, "The Word became flesh." But the 2 Gospels in between, Matthew and Luke, decided, apparently independently, that a good way to start their accounts of Jesus was with an infancy narrative. Now there's a slight difficulty in that these 2 accounts don't always match up neatly. Matthew's account seems to present things from Joseph's perspective, whereas Luke's account tends to present things from Mary's. But I'm not going to worry about these differences. While there are ways of harmonising the 2 accounts, I prefer to deal with each version separately. The bigger problem is that these accounts are now nearly 2,000 years old and were written in a very different cultural context to us. And this has resulted in a number of wrong understandings being added to the Christmas story over the centuries. And so when you think about the Christmas story, I'm afraid that quite a lot of your mental picture is entirely wrong. These are what I call the myths of Christmas, and my job in this video is to explode some of those myths. I want to pare back the story to its barest details and then fill it in with the original cultural context, and hopefully the end result will be a far richer and more meaningful account of Jesus' amazing birth. None of what I have to say is new. It's just that year after year we watch Nativity Plays and sing Christmas carols that have lots of details that have been added to the Christmas story over the years, to the point where we can barely discern the original story anymore. However, before we can get into the myths of Christmas, I need to take you through an important linguistic concept: implicit information. Implicit information refers to stuff that is understood but not stated explicitly in a text. The concept comes out of relevancy theory. For an utterance to be relevant, 2 conditions must be met. On the one hand, it must provide us with new information, because we don't usually consider it relevant to be told things we already know. On the other hand, relevant information must in some sense link up with what we already know. Information that does not relate to what we already know seems irrelevant. Now, I'm sure you can understand how this relates to school. For example, if a teacher only told students things they already knew, then the students would be bored senseless. But if what is taught doesn't connect in some way with what is already known, then the students will be completely bamboozled. Relevancy theory also relates to the interpretation of literary texts. Again, we don't like to be told stuff we already know. But what we read needs to connect with what we already know, otherwise we won't understand the text. And authors intuitively know this. So when an author writes a story, they need to decide what information to include and what information they can happily leave out because their readers will just know what's going on. That is the implicit information. Information that can be left out because readers will know about it without needing to be told. This means that problems can occur whenever the audience of a text changes. In other words, implicit information only works within its initial historical cultural context. If you take a story into another culture, then you very quickly discover that you need to explain certain things. And it's the same for stories as they age. Books from previous centuries often require additional explanations. Now, we can probably read a Dickens novel without too much trouble, similarly with a Jane Austen, but even then, sometimes we'll come across something in the text that we find puzzling. They make a reference to something, and we'll be like, wait, what are they talking about? Something that they didn't need to explain to their contemporary audience now requires additional comment. And so, modern editions of classic literary works will often include explanatory footnotes, making explicit what was originally left implicit. Now, these moments can be a little disconcerting to the modern reader, but what is far worse is when we fill in a gap in the text with the wrong implicit information without even realizing it. This can happen very easily with texts that come from a very different time and culture from ours. Without thinking about it, we just read the text through the lens of our contemporary context, and we therefore end up importing a lot of our context into the text. And it's worse because we usually don't even notice we're doing it. And as a result, we end up misinterpreting the text. Well, this is nowhere more noticeable than in the Christmas story. So, let's explode some Christmas myths. First, Jesus and his family were not white. I know, right? It's a shocker. This one is almost too much to get our heads around. After centuries of white European representations of Jesus in religious art, we find it almost impossible to picture Jesus as anything other than white with blonde hair and blue eyes. Actually, this is slowly starting to change. This was the Jesus they chose for the Jesus film. Don't know about you, but I get a bit of a California surfer vibe from this guy. This is the Jesus from the Matthew film. This actor was Italian, which at least is Mediterranean, but he's still pretty white. More recently, the actor they chose to play Jesus in The Shack was from Israel, and the actor who played Jesus in the Risen movie was Maori. And speaking of Maori actors, the actor who played Mary in the Nativity movie was half Maori. Even more recently still, the actor who plays Jesus in The Chosen has a Middle Eastern heritage, even though he was born in New York. The point is, Jesus was born into a typical Middle Eastern Jewish family. The image of Jesus on the right was generated by a group of scientists a couple of years ago. In determining Jesus' appearance, they referred to drawings found at various archaeological sites and dated to the 1st century. From these, they deduced that Jesus would have had dark rather than light-coloured eyes, and in keeping with Jewish tradition, he would have had a beard. His hair would have been short. Please refer to 1 Corinthians 11:14 for the proof. And his skin would have had a darker complexion than we typically imagine, not unlike the olive skin common among Middle Easterners today. Princeton biblical scholar James Charlesworth goes so far as to say Jesus was most likely dark brown and suntanned. It's certainly rather different to the traditional view. And the same would have been true of his mother, Mary, as well. In fact, there's been a bit of a movement in recent years, generally in Catholic countries in the two-thirds world, to celebrate Mary using the title the Black Madonna. And this recognition of the darker skin tones of the Holy Family is making some inroads into contemporary religious art, as these images demonstrate. So, Jesus and his family were not white. That's myth number 1, exploded. What is your mental picture of Mary and Joseph as they travelled from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Perhaps you imagine a scene such as these. Now that's a common Christmas card image, just the two of them travelling alone. Mary, heavily pregnant, sitting on a donkey with Joseph leading the way. And this picture appears quite early in church history. This one, for example, is from the 1300s, from a mosaic in a Byzantine church. And this is the relatively recent Nativity movie. But where does this idea come from? Well, in Luke we read, "In those days Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child." So, since the only people named are Mary and Joseph, that's who we picture as travelling to Bethlehem. But this is almost certainly not the case. Joseph and Mary did not travel to Bethlehem alone. Chances are Joseph's whole extended family would have made this journey. This is a classic case of implicit information. Obviously, we can't ask Luke about this, but if we were to ask him if Mary and Joseph travelled to Bethlehem alone, he may well have said, "Of course not." This is something that would have been obvious to the original audience, and so he doesn't need to mention it. Now, Joseph's extended family might not all have come from Nazareth. They might have collected more of the extended family as they travelled from town to town, but everyone had to return to their place of birth to participate in the census, so there would have been a lot of people travelling. And all of the members of Joseph's family, if they were not currently living in Bethlehem, would need to travel home. This fact will be significant, as we will see shortly. It's also quite likely that there was no donkey. Mary, even in her pregnant state, probably walked the whole way. The journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem is about 120 kilometres, which works out to be 3 days of steady walking. The idea of Mary riding a donkey comes from a 2nd century apocryphal work, the Proto-Evangelium of James, probably one of the earliest examples of Bible-based fan fiction. But it would have been perfectly normal for a pregnant teenager in antiquity with an active lifestyle to walk such a journey. And Mary was probably not 9 months pregnant when she made the journey. And she was definitely not in the throes of labour when they arrived in Bethlehem. Because Luke explicitly tells us in verse 6, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. In other words, they arrived in Bethlehem well before the due date. And this means they stayed in Bethlehem for an extended period of time. This fact will also be significant, as we will see shortly. So, that's actually 3 myths for the price of 1, and all exploded. Despite what you see in just about every nativity play, I am so sorry to have to break it to you. There was definitely no inn and no innkeeper. Mary and Joseph would have been in Bethlehem for an extended period of time, and they would have been staying with Joseph's relatives in a regular house. But because Joseph's extended family would have been there, the place would have been bursting at the seams. Luke tells us, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the Kataluma. The traditional translation of this Greek word Kataluma is usually inn. And then when we hear no room in the inn, we actually think no rooms in the inn. So because there were no rooms in the inn, and because of the mention of a manger, which is an animal feeding trough, we end up adding an innkeeper and a stable to the story. However, the Greek word translated here as room actually means place, and kataluma should not be translated as inn. Rather, it means guest room. And Luke's Gospel provides us with 2 very helpful pieces of evidence that this is how we should understand this word. Firstly, when that same word, kataluma, occurs in Luke 22 verse 11, it very clearly means guest room. This is the place where Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Last Supper, and this event definitely did not take place in a public inn. It took place in someone's house, in their guest room, which in this case was an upper room located above the rest of the house. Secondly, Luke uses a completely different word when he wants to refer to an inn. It comes up in the parable of the Good Samaritan, when the Samaritan takes the man to a pandocheion, that is, a public inn, and then gives the innkeeper money to look after the man. So Luke knows the correct word for an inn, and he doesn't use that word in Luke 2. So getting back to Bethlehem, we need to translate kataluma as guest room, which I am very pleased to say the New Living Translation and the most recent version of the NIV both do. But we might still wonder a little about what's going on here, especially with that puzzling reference to a manger. Well, this is where implicit information comes into it again. Luke knows that his contemporary readers will know what's going on, but for us, it helps to know a little bit about what houses looked like at this time. Here is a picture of a typical one-room house from the side. You'll notice that there is an area at the bottom where they could bring their animals in out of the cold overnight. Then here's the same house, but this time from above. You can see right next to the animal area there were receptacles in the floor where food for animals could be placed. Mangers. Basically, the family would live in this one room. They would prepare food here and eat here, and then at night they would bring the animals into that lower area, and then they would sleep in this room too. Once your nose adjusted to the smell, presumably the animals were an added source of warmth during the winter. Plus, they were protected from thieves and wild animals. Now, some houses were a little bigger. They had a second room where the family could sleep. Or it could be used as a guest room when you had guests. And this was the Cartaluma. Now, picture what this house would have been like during the census, when everyone had to return to their place of birth. The whole house would have been chock full of visitors. So when the time came, Mary had to give birth in the main room. What this means is that Mary didn't go through this difficult process alone in a cold, drafty stable. She would have been surrounded by the womenfolk of Joseph's family and presumably the village midwife. In fact, that's probably why the guest room was full. They sent all the men in there to get them out the way. And then afterwards, she wrapped Jesus in cloths and placed him in one of the feeding troughs. Now this had enormous significance for the shepherds who enter the story at this point. Listen to this quotation from Ken Bailey, a biblical scholar with extensive experience of the cultures of the Middle East. In Luke 2, 8-14, the first people to hear the message of the birth of Jesus were a group of shepherds who were close to the bottom of the social scale in their society. The shepherds heard and were afraid. Initially, they were probably frightened by the sight of the angels, but later they were asked to visit the child. From their point of view, if the child was truly the Messiah, the parents would reject the shepherds if they tried to visit him. How could shepherds be convinced to expect a welcome? The angels anticipated this anxiety and told the shepherds they would find the baby wrapped, which was what peasants like the shepherds did with their newly born children. Furthermore, they were told that he was lying in a manger. That is, they would find the Christ child in an ordinary peasant house, such as theirs. He was not in a governor's mansion or a wealthy merchant's guest room. Perhaps they would not be told, "Unclean shepherds, be gone." This was their sign, a sign for lowly shepherds. So this business with the swaddling clothes and the manger was a powerful message that the Messiah was actually one of them. He had been born in a peasant house, just like the ones these shepherds lived in. And this underlines the significance of Jesus' name, Emmanuel, God with us. When the Word became flesh, he was not born into wealth and privilege. As Paul tells us in Philippians 2, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. But this did not happen in a dirty stable out the back of a full to overflowing inn. It happened in the context of a humble peasant family. So, there definitely was no inn and no innkeeper. Myth well and truly exploded. Okay, this last one is probably not going to be as big a surprise, but it still demonstrates that you can't always believe what you hear in Christmas carols. Take this one, for example. We three kings of Orient. Okay, that's enough. There are at least 3 errors in that one line alone. These guys were not kings. We don't actually know how many there were, and the grammar is all messed up. Oh, the things songwriters do for a rhyme. Anyway, Matthew tells us that they were magi. This was the name given by the Babylonians, Medes and Persians to wise men, teachers, priests, physicians, astrologers, seers, interpreters of dreams, soothsayers, sorcerers and magicians. And this fits with what the text tells us, which is that they had seen something in the sky that they had interpreted as indicating the birth of a powerful and important king. and they had followed the astrological trail to Judea. So referring to the Magi as wise men is okay. But keep in mind, there may even have been some wise women among them too. After all, the word magi is a masculine plural noun in the Greek, and the masculine plural was often used to refer to both men and women together. So the visit of the Magi may have included women too. But why do we think there were only 3 of them? Well, the text mentions 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But even then, there may have been more than 3 gifts. There might have been a few different things made out of gold, a couple of containers of frankincense, and so on. The point is, these wealthy foreign astrologers opened their treasures and gave Jesus gifts that recognized his kingly status. More than that, the text says they worshipped him. This is a startling acknowledgement of Jesus' divinity. Oh, and did you notice something else here? Matthew says, when they came to the house. So if you're wanting more evidence for busting myth number 3, there it is. So, there may not have been only 3 wise men. And that's the last Christmas myth exploded.
Let's go home.
So, there we have it. I've exploded some of the myths that have crept into the Christmas story. Jesus and his family were not white. Joseph and Mary did not travel to Bethlehem alone. Mary probably did not ride a donkey, and she was definitely not in the throes of labour when they arrived in Bethlehem. There was definitely no inn or innkeeper, and there may not have been only 3 wise men and or women. It is my fervent hope that you will never forget these things, no matter how much these mythical additions keep getting repeated year after year after year, because the true story of Christmas is powerful enough as it is. It's the story of how God himself became one of us, and this happened at a specific time and place in a particular cultural context. But Jesus was born into a family, and his birth was celebrated by lowly shepherds who saw in Jesus one of them, and by wealthy foreign astrologers who, based on astronomical signs, identified Jesus as a divine king with a universal kingdom. So may we, when we hear the Christmas story, not lose sight of the amazing depths and resonances that are present, because it truly is the beginning of the greatest story ever told.